I'll leave at dawn. Leanne's voice was a whisper of silk in the coarse-grained room, a sound too fine for the rough, honeyed timber walls and the dust moays dancing in the day's last slanted light. She stood by the single window, her back to him, a resolute figure carved from porcelain and defiance. The red of her Chong Sam, embroidered with golden phoenixes that promised prosperity and a future that had dissolved into smoke, was a wound against the muted browns and grays of the cabin. She had not wept, not since the merchant, Mr. Albright, had looked her over like livestock and declared her unsuitable, his dismissal a public spectacle in the center of Redemption's only street. Jasper watched her from his chair, the weight of his pistol a familiar pressure against his hip, but the weight in his chest was new and unwelcome. He had been paid to bring her here from the coast, a simple job of escort. He was a guide, a shield against the dangers of the trail, not a custodian of broken dreams. Her dignity was a thing of terrifying power. It shamed the dust on his boots and the weariness in his bones. He should have felt relief. His job was done. Her refusal of his offer to find her passage back was her own affair. Yet the quiet finality of her declaration, "I'll leave at dawn," hooked into him like a burr. He imagined her walking out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the plains, a single slash of defiant red against an indifferent horizon. And the thought made the air in his lungs feel thin and tight. He said nothing, a habit so deeply ingrained it was a part of his very marrow. Silence was his shield. He just watched the rigid line of her spine, the faint tremor in her hands she thought he couldn't see, and knew that dawn was only hours away. Leanne kept her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape outside, the jagged teeth of the distant mountains biting into a sky bruised with purple and orange. She would not let this man, this quiet, watchful gunslinger, see the fear that threatened to unravel her. She was the daughter of a scholar raised on tales of honor and resilience. She had crossed an ocean with a portrait of a smiling, prosperous man and a heart full of carefully tended hope. The journey with Jasper had been one of sterile distance. He was a silent presence, efficient and detached, his eyes the color of a stormy sky revealing nothing. He had kept her safe from bandits and the leering stares of men in dusty outposts, his duty performed with a grim competence. But when they had arrived in Redemption and missed her, Albright had taken one look at her, his lip curling in disdain. Jasper had been there. He had stood motionless as Albright declared the arrangement void, his voice loud for all the town to hear, that the woman in the picture was delicate, and this one had a look of defiance in her eyes. It was a look that would not suit his household. Humiliation had washed over Leanne, hot and sharp, but she had lifted her chin and met the merchant's gaze until he looked away, flustered. It was Jasper who had stepped forward then, his voice low and cutting, dispersing the gathering crowd with a single cold glance. He had led her here to his small Spartan cabin at the edge of town, a temporary refuge that felt more like a cage. She had been an object of a transaction that had failed. She was now a ghost, untethered and unseen, with nowhere to go but forward into the vast, unknowable emptiness of this land. Leaving at dawn was not a choice. It was the only piece of her future she could still command. The cabin was a world of suffocating stillness, broken only by the hum of insects outside and the creak of the floorboards as Jasper shifted his weight. He had offered her his cot, taking the lone wooden chair for himself, and now the small space was charged with a tension that was both intimate and agonizingly distant. Leanne sat on the edge of the cot, her hands folded in the lap of her silk dress, a garment meant for a wedding celebration that had become a shroud for her hopes. Every curious glance from the townsfolk earlier had felt like a physical blow, their whispers following her down the street. They saw a failed bride, an exotic curiosity, an omen of misfortune. Jasper had been a barrier between her and their judgment, his presence a silent warning. But now, in the confines of his home, he was an enigma. He did not speak of what happened, offered no words of pity or counsel. He simply existed in the space with her, his quietude a heavy blanket. She felt his gaze on her, not unkind, but analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had no interest in owning. She was a complication, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his solitary life. His reluctance to be burdened was as clear as the polished steel of his gun. For Leanne, this was a familiar feeling, She had been a burden on her family, another daughter to be married off. She had been a burden to the merchant who had rejected her. Now she was a burden to the gunslinger who had saved her from immediate disgrace, only to trap her in this prolonged, silent agony of obligation. She could not bear it. Her pride, the last unblemished thing she owned, demanded she sever this tie. Walking into the wilderness was a terrifying prospect, but it was a fate she would choose for herself, not one she would have thrust upon her. Night fell completely, pressing in on the small cabin until the single lantern on the table seemed to be the only light left in the world. It cast long dancing shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more infinite. Jasper sat in his chair methodically stripping and cleaning his revolver. The familiar metallic clicks a rhythm against the profound silence, but his hands moved by memory. His attention was entirely on the woman across the room. He saw the way the lantern light caught the gold threads in her dress, the graceful curve of her neck as she stared at the floor, lost in thoughts he could not begin to fathom. He was a man who understood endings. He had seen them in dusty street duels, in the bottom of a whiskey glass, in the eyes of men who had lost everything. He had orchestrated a few himself. He had built his life on the principle of moving on, of never letting anyone or anything get a purchase on him. He had brought her here out of a flicker of something, pity maybe, or a stubborn refusal to see a bully like Albright win so easily. But now she was here, a still silent testament to a world of grace and honor that he had long since forgotten. Clear's throat, he thought of his own past, the reasons he chose the solitary road, the faces he had left behind. He preferred the clean, simple logic of survival. You point, you shoot, you move on. Leanne was not simple. Her quiet suffering was a reproach to his entire existence. He could feel her fear, a low hum beneath her incredible composure, and it resonated with a deep, buried part of himself he had thought long dead. To let her walk out at dawn would be the sensible thing, the thing that would restore the stark simplicity of his life. It would also be an act of cowardice he wasn't sure he could live with. A sudden scratching sound at the door, followed by a low growl from the darkness, shattered the cabin's tense equilibrium. Leanne flinched, her head snapping up, her eyes wide and dark in the lantern light. Jasper's hand went to his gun out of pure instinct, his body tensing before he relaxed, recognizing the sound. "Just a coyote," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. Drawn by the light, he saw the tremor in her hands before she quickly clasped them together, hiding the evidence of her fear. The small disruption had broken the spell of silence between them. He rose and walked to the water barrel in the corner, his movements slow and deliberate. He dipped a tin cup and brought it to her. Here it was not a question. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a brief, startling contact of his rough, calloused skin against hers. The shock of it, so unexpected and human, seemed to pass between them like a current. She took a sip, her throat working. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He simply nodded, retreating to his side of the room. But the space had changed. The invisible wall between them had developed a crack. He no longer saw just a symbol of his unwanted responsibility. He saw a young woman, terrified and alone, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known, trying to hold herself together with sheer will. And in her eyes, as she looked at him over the rim of the cup, he thought he saw something other than fear or gratitude. He saw a flicker of recognition, as if she were seeing past the gunslinger, past the stoic facade to the man beneath. It was a look that made him profoundly uncomfortable, yet one he found he did not want to turn away from. The first hint of dawn was a pale pearlescent gray filtering through the window, diluting the shadows in the cabin. It was the color of ghosts, of endings and beginnings. Leanne had not slept. She had watched the lantern burn down until its flames sputtered and died, leaving them in the intimate darkness. Now, with the arrival of the light, the hour of her departure was upon her. She rose from the cot, her movements fluid and noiseless. Every gesture was imbued with a sense of ceremony, as if she were performing a sacred rite. She folded the blanket he had given her with precise, careful hands, placing it at the foot of the cot. She picked up the small silk-wrapped bundle that contained all she had left in the world, a change of clothes, a small jade pendant from her mother, and the smiling portrait of the man who had so casually discarded her. She moved towards the door, a silent wraith and a blood-red dress. Jasper had not moved from his chair all night. He watched her every motion, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The gray light etched the lines of exhaustion and conflict onto his features. This was it, the moment of release. She would walk through that door, and his life would return to its predictable empty rhythm. He would be free of the suffocating weight of her quiet dignity, of the mirror her presence held up to his own broken honor. He could ride out, find another job, and in a week the memory of the Chinese bride in the red dress would be nothing more than a faint, troublesome dream. His mind screamed at him to let her go. It was logical, it was safe. It was what he always did. But his heart, a long, dormant, and stubborn organ, was beating a frantic, rebellious tattoo against his ribs. He saw her small hand, pale and slender, reach for the iron door latch. The sound of that latch lifting would be the sound of his own damnation. The soft click of the latch lifting echoed in the stillness, a sound as final as a gunshot. Leanne's fingers were cold on the iron, her knuckles white. She took a shallow breath, steeling herself for the vast, empty world that waited on the other side. She would walk east towards the rising sun, and she would not look back. She would survive. It was the only promise she could make to herself. Behind her, the scraping of a chair against the wooden floor was a violent intrusion into her solitary resolve. Not alone. The words were a low whisper, a growly sound that seemed torn from the very depths of him. They were not loud, but they filled the small cabin, stopping her as effectively as a physical hand on her shoulder. Time seemed to stutter and hold its breath. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jasper was standing now, his tall frame blocking the growing light from the window. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. It was no longer guarded or distant. It was raw, exposed, and utterly fixed on her. Confusion wared with a fragile, burgeoning hope inside her. What did he mean? Was this another form of pity, a temporary gesture he would soon regret? She clutched her small bundle tighter, her only anchor in this sudden, bewildering shift. He took a step towards her, then another, closing the distance between them until only a few feet of charged air remained. "You walk out that door," he said, his voice still low but clear and steady. "Now I walk with you." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that altered the very fabric of her reality. The sun was rising, and with it a future she could never have imagined. The world outside the cabin was coming alive. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the first bird's song cut through the morning chill. Inside, a new world was being born in the quiet space between them. Leanne stared at Jasper, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, for the familiar look of reluctant duty. She found none. What she saw in his stormy eyes was a fierce resolve that mirrored her own, a decision made and settled. Why? The word was a breath, a question she had to ask, even though she was terrified of the answer. She was prepared for him to speak of honor, of responsibility, of a debt he felt he owed. Instead, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "Because a man who would throw away something so fine for a look in the eye," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "is a fool. And this land is full of fools. It's no place to be on your own." It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment, and the most honest thing she suspected he had said in years. A slow warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the cold dread that had been her constant companion. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The decision was made. A silent partnership was forged. The preparations were swift and conducted in a new kind of silence, one of shared purpose. He gathered supplies, a bedroll, a full canteen, dried rations packed into his saddle bags. She neatly repacked her own small bundle, her movements no longer brittle with desperation, but filled with a quiet sense of purpose. He worked with an efficient grace, his long-limbed body moving with the confidence of a man at home in the wild. When he handed her the heavy canteen, his fingers brushed hers again. This time neither of them pulled away. The touch lingered, a small, silent acknowledgement of the new path they were taking, a path that led away from redemption and into the unknown. Together they left the town behind as the sun climbed higher, painting the dusty landscape in shades of warm gold. They walked, not rode, Jasper leading his horse by the reins. He had insisted it was better this way, to put distance between them and the town without drawing attention. The trail led them into the rolling hills, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of redemption. The air was warm and smelled of sage brush and dry earth. For the first few miles they walked in a comfortable silence, the rhythm of their footsteps and the soft snort of the horse the only sounds. He walked beside her, a steady, reassuring presence. The brilliant red of her Chiang Sam was a beacon in the vast landscape, a defiant splash of life against the muted tones of the wilderness. He found he could not stop looking at her. When they stopped to rest by a small gurgling creek shaded by a cluster of cottonwood trees, the intimacy of their shared journey settled around them. She knelt by the water's edge, splashing the cool liquid on her face and neck. He watched the droplets cling to her skin like tiny jewels. When she looked up at him, her face fresh and open, her dark eyes reflecting the clear blue sky, he felt a shift inside him, a final wall crumbling to dust. He moved to her, kneeling in front of her. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his calloused thumb gently brushed a stray drop of water from her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. "Leanne," he said, speaking her name for the first time. It felt right on his tongue. She did not look away. Her gaze was steady, trusting. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. He pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question. It was the taste of dust and water and a loneliness so profound he hadn't realized he was drowning in it. She responded with a soft sigh, her hand coming up to rest on his arm, and the kiss deepened, becoming a promise, a confirmation, a discovery of a language they both understood without words. They continued east, the sun warm on their backs. The kiss had changed everything. The silence that fell between them now was no longer one of necessity or awkwardness, but of deep and abiding connection. It was a silence filled with unspoken understanding, with the shared memory of a tender, transformative moment by the creek. They walked closer now, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Each touch was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that they were no longer two separate souls, adrift in a harsh world but two people on a single path. Jasper found himself pointing out landmarks, the distant mesa shaped like a sleeping giant, the hawk circling high overhead, the name of a wild flower growing by the trail. He spoke more in that afternoon than he had in the entire previous week. His words simple and direct, but carrying the weight of a man opening his world to another. Leanne, in turn, began to share pieces of her own story. She spoke of the gardens in her home province, of the taste of moon cakes during the Mid-Autumn Festival, of the brother who taught her to read poetry. Her voice was like music, painting pictures of a life so different from his own. Yet he found himself captivated, seeing the world she came from through her eyes. In her he saw a strength that had nothing to do with wielding a weapon, a resilience forged not in violence, but in grace. In him she saw a gentleness and a deep-seated honor that his fearsome reputation completely belied. He was not just a gunslinger. He was a man who had chosen to stand for someone when it would have been far easier to walk away. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows before them, they stopped on a ridge overlooking a vast open valley. The horizon was a limitless expanse of possibility. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, possessive gesture that felt as natural as breathing. The future was a blank map, its territories unknown and its dangers real. But for the first time in a very long time, for both of them, it did not feel empty. It felt like